So I think I have a little bit of a different background in education than most of the people here. I come from the landscape architecture program over in the Faculty of Architecture. I can see a few of my classmates are here, which is great. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming, guys. And so we work at a slightly different scale than most GIS information, although we do rely on GIS information sometimes. We're typically just getting contour lines and maybe some other information from it, not quite the city scale that you guys are working at. And so with that, we rely on Cynthia a lot for our contour data of the city and things like that. So for the landscape, like the topography, one issue I found is that the vegetation, there's no distinction between the topography and the vegetation. Like you get a point cloud and it's all one continuous surface. So even if you subsample the points to have less points and then mesh that, there's no isolation of the two. And then one other issue I found too is something like the dam, which is a man-made structure. It has a lot of straight lines, hard edges. The point cloud doesn't cover everything, like it doesn't always see everything, and so you end up with some blobby looking structures. So you have to remodel that yourself. So in this model here, I actually use the point cloud as a 3D scaled reference for me to 3D model around. And then the landscape here is a mesh. So you can see there's some distinction between the two models, and I'll get a little bit more into that right away. So the method I've used to isolate vegetation, and although it doesn't always work, it's pretty effective, is these are section cuts of the landscape. I take the whole mesh, so that image on the left, it zooms in and it's just showing a section cut through the mesh. I run a function that cuts contour lines through the topography. So you cut it all down. And then I'm using some programming in what's called Grasshopper, which is a parametric plugin for the 3D modeling program Rhino. I can take all of those lines, and because all the lines have a length to them, I can measure the length, and then I can play around with some different variables, and I can actually isolate the vegetation from the topography. So then with that, you can see I've shown how I isolated it and separated it. That's the same thing from the topography. And so with that, I then can map out the vegetation and provide myself with a topography of the site, which also has the contour lines, which I can set the interval. So right now I think this is a 10 centimeter interval, which is it's pretty nice. And there's always going to be issues with isolating the vegetation. Like I've run into problems where if it's a dense forest, the mesh is so tight that it makes really thick contour lines that it's hard to isolate the topography from the vegetation. And also some other noise, like this site has some artifacts of the dam sticking up in big granite boulders that it thinks are trees, but it's a way quicker process to edit that out than to try and map it all yourself. And it's also like a lot less mind-numbing. So this is just a simple diagram showing how I figure the diameter of the tree. And actually looking back over my aerial images, it's fairly accurate. Like there's a bit of adjustments that have to happen, and there's some discrepancies between the point cloud and the drone scan and everything, because there's wind that kind of can shift the angle a bit. But yeah, it's just showing I take one of those curves, what was in that was a certain length. You typically have a range from the contours, and then you measure the area and then plot a circle. And so this is just showing where they are on site along with the contour lines. And so back after that, I'm just going to talk about how you quickly go over how you would remesh contour lines into a topographic model. So this also works, and I use the same method when I'd say from Cynthia get the contour lines from the city. You know how like you can get really nice contour lines of the river. So I can take these contour lines. This is just something I made up. I mean like the contours, I just drew them. I can take the contours, and each of the lines is made up of a series of control points. So a polyline is just a bunch of points connected. So if I take that and I get just the points, I can run what's called the Delaunay mesh triangulation on it. And so this right here is just showing how all those get remeshed into a digital landscape model. And so there's some errors that come up, but nothing you can't work on and fix. So then this is showing, it has the contour lines as well. This is a 3D model I now have of the site. And it can be, the dam can be 3D printed or CNC'd. That's one of the things we do in the lab. Another process I've been working on with the 3D landscape is I've been looking at how to do drainage simulations, and this is still something in the works, and it crashes and it doesn't always work, but it's pretty exciting. I'll just have to go back to a mesh, but I hope I'm not confusing anyone. But a mesh, the 3D model of a mesh is made up of a bunch of triangles. They're just like those points in space from the point cloud triangulated back together, like here. You can see those are all triangles on the right. They just exist in 3D space, so they're 3D triangles. So my water flow simulation just simulates water flowing across mesh triangles at a large scale. And so when you're with water flow simulation, water always flows perpendicular to a contour line. So if you can cut a contour line into a triangle, you can get the direction of water flow. And that's just the background or the theory behind how this works. And so that's it simulated on the landscape. Sometimes when it's a flat surface, it kind of dances back and forth, but generally, like, it doesn't account for any porosity of the topography, but it's still showing the general flow of water, which is a really exciting tool to use when you're designing for a site, because you don't have to sit there and figure it out and draw it all out. You can just get it on the fly. And so that's a view, like a plan view of the site with some water flow simulation. And that's my presentation. Any questions? Comments? Ryan. Yeah, you could, using Grasshopper, you could measure the angles of curves and then have colors, say, or maybe a line weight associated with the direction. Yeah, you could do that.
It's my understanding that Pix4D, at least the latest release, you could quantify or get a DTM. So were you not able to create a digital terrain model using Pix4D?
Yeah, using Pix4D though, it's really hard to isolate the vegetation. So I use Pix4D and I get the point cloud and then subsample the point cloud and then remesh that and then run the contours and then use the mesh. So the DTM that Pix4D provides, I find, has a lot of noise in it. So it's a matter of, you can either take that or remesh it yourself. So yeah, I found that with Pix4D, there is a function to try and isolate vegetation and topography, but it doesn't really work yet. It's in the process, or maybe just all the files that I've tried plugging into it, maybe they just didn't have quite the right parameters involved or the right color data or grouping of points. But yeah. Yes, yeah, I use Pix4D. Yep, exactly that.
You want to comment on just the requirements around flying the drone? Like, did you encounter any issues with the aviation authorities? Did you have to get a license?
For this, no. Oh, sorry.
Is it, I don't know if it's classified differently because you're doing research or?
In the summer before, a classmate and I were working on this, and we were looking into all the legal issues involved with flying the drone. And for this, because it's a provincial park outside the city, it was okay to fly, but something in the city right now, it's treated as if it's a small manned aircraft. So you wouldn't really be able to legally fly it in the city. People do it all the time, but it's something right now that I can't like legally recommend you to be doing. But I think it'll change. Yeah, like I imagine if they follow the United States with their policies, it would be you'd have to go and kind of get like your license to fly it and register your drone and then arrange with people to fly it, because right now it's like you can't fly within 100 meters of anything anybody owns or anybody. And I think that's a little silly. Like it's a little extreme to do that, but yeah, I think it's changing as far as I understand anyways.
Is this the software of choice? Is there any better software that you wouldn't have to do so much work?
I know that there's a software, I can't remember what it's called, it's Geo something, that there's I think it's $250,000 software out there that I think it's more accurate than Pix 4D. But I'm not sure if it isolates vegetation. I know from what I've seen of it doing, there's less noise in it, and it's produces potentially more detailed models. But I'm not sure if they isolate vegetation. From what I've seen, they don't, but maybe they do if they've updated it, because I haven't looked at it in over a year. So.
So yours doesn't use LiDAR?
No. Yeah.
Well, you would use LiDAR to isolate vegetation from the ground.
Yeah. Well, because doesn't it, LiDAR uses reflectance data to get vegetation from the ground? Yeah. Yeah. So we could do something like a thermal scan as well, because then you can potentially, like you could see through the vegetation. But yeah, it's a different type of scan. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, well, when I looked at the DEM of the site in GIS, the scan was at such a broad scale that there was only like 3 different elevation changes. So for this site, I don't really think it would work, but maybe for another site it could help. I think the approach you would take was actually like do multiple scans, like so maybe a Pix 4D scan using images, and then maybe like a thermal scan. And if you could have maybe some reference points that you manually place on site, you might be able to start working back and forth between them to help isolate that data. But I think the scale of the GIS information that's available, at least for this site, it doesn't really work. But some other sites it might. Yeah. Do you have a question? You mean like under the water? Under the water? I don't think a thermal scan would work, but I think people use different lights, like infrared light. I'm not sure if that's correct, but you might be able to use infrared light or other forms of light that would be able to see through. But I'm not quite sure, but I think people do some of that. I saw a guy nodding over there, so maybe he knows. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.